Welcome to the Daily Horror Habit Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Krieger, bringing you daily reviews of current and classic horror movies for your twisted pleasure. Be aware that these reviews and discussions may include spoilers. And as always, I hope you enjoy.
Suppose what your faith has said was essentially correct. Suppose there is a universal mind controlling everything. A God willing the behavior of every subatomic particle. Now, every particle has an antiparticle. Its mirror image, its negative side. Maybe this universal mind resides in the mirror image instead of in our universe as we wanted to believe. Maybe he's anti-God, bringing darkness instead of light.
Why weren't we told the truth?
Without the technology to confirm, it would have been another legend.
But he was our prisoner, not yours. We had a responsibility to warn the rest of the world. Only the corrupt are listened to now. And they tell us what we want to hear. We believe it to be divine light.
Welcome to the first installment of my year-long Masters of Horror celebration, in which I'm joined by a guest every Friday to chat about one of their favorite films from our month's featured director. And for the month of January, we're honoring none other than the legendary rebel of horror himself, John Carpenter. And today I'm joined by managing editor of KillerHorrorCritic.com, the host of Killer Horror Critic Podcast, and wannabe werewolf Matt Konopka, to chat about Prince of Darkness. Matt, welcome to the show.
Hello, and yes, I am a wannabe werewolf.
It is an absolute pleasure to have you on the show to talk about John Carpenter today.
It's great to be here to talk about one of the masters of horror.
The only place to start is to ask you about your Carpenter origin story. What was the first film you watched of his?
Yeah, so funny enough, my first Carpenter film was actually my first horror film and my first film. So,
oh man, a first of firsts.
A first of firsts. Yeah, so no, my first Carpenter film was actually Christine, which for those that are less familiar, I guess, is the one about the killer car that takes vengeance on Arnie's bullies. But anyway, the first was Christine for me. I saw it when I was like 3 years old, I believe. We had a VHS tape that I pretty much wore the shit out of because I'd watch it every day. and my parents, my parents are pretty laid back about that kind of stuff. They didn't care too much. I mean, there were certain horror films, obviously I wasn't able to watch at 3, but for whatever reason, I don't even think they screened Christine necessarily. I think they just thought, oh, it's a car, no big deal, What could possibly be bad about this movie? And so yes, they didn't care about me watching it until one moment when my grandma was over, and there's that scene where Christine is following the car of the bullies, and one of them turns around and like flicks off Christine and is like, Axel. And that scene came around, and I turned right around to my grandmother and did the same thing, just flicked her off her asshole. And after that, I wasn't allowed to watch Christine for a little bit, but yeah, that was the film that both got me into Carpenter and the horror genre. I just instantly fell in love with it as a little kid then.
Yeah, that's a really remarkable film too, because it is a great display of just Carpenter able to get across like his style, not only tonally, but also just like his synth score, right? And how he's always very music heavy with his films. And it's such a ridiculous concept for a movie. And yet the way that he makes it, it has such a great sense of style to it that it really comes across as being far more menacing than it really should be. It's a movie about a killer car. And at the end of the day, you're going to get those people that essentially they're like, oh, you could just like run down that alley, or you could just sidestep it or something like that. But then when you're watching the film, it is a lot more menacing than you would probably anticipate.
Part of the brilliance of Christine is just how Carpenter gets us involved with the characters, because a killer car was not a new idea at that point. Right. Because we'd already had films like The Car from the 70s, and it was an idea that had already existed, and all those films are very campy and funny, and not very scary. But Christine was a little bit different, because Stephen King had already laid out a pretty psychologically in-depth study of this character Arnie, and I think what Carpenter did really well is that they kind of just cut the whole possessed ghost aspect out of it. Like, I don't know if you've ever read the original Christine novel, but it goes very deep into the ghost that possesses the car. So you have a lot of scenes with Arnie conversing with this ghost, and you get the idea that it's possessing him. And in the film, it more feels like an obsession of Arnie's. It feels less like there is any kind of spiritual presence taking him over, and it feels more like he's just becoming so obsessed with this car because the rest of the world has sort of shut him out. So this car becomes his life. So I think because of that, you just really get into kind of the disturbed psychology of that character, and it makes it a lot more frightening, because you put yourself in his friend's shoes, and like, we've all kind of had that friend that has that, maybe sort of addiction that you want to help him with, and you can feel kind of helpless at times because you're not able to pull them out of that, right? So this whole film kind of feels like that to me. And then it has these extra layers too of these kids in high school, and they don't really seem like they'd be good friends if they hadn't met earlier in life. Like, one of them's a huge jock, the other one's kind of, not very popular and made fun of by everybody, and you get the sense that this is maybe kind of their last hurrah, like they won't be friends after high school. And so it just, it has a lot of these layers of just like the end of an era, and the end of friendships. And so, it's an emotional film, I actually think. It's
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, like, a lot of people look at Christine and you do just on the surface think, oh yeah, it's that silly killer car movie, but it's actually got a lot going on underneath the surface of it.
Yeah, he humanizes the film in a way that I wasn't expecting. I don't think most people are expecting. And it really is that character-driven aspect that makes it that much more of a kind of an emotionally engaging film than, again, like you would expect going into it. But in terms of like John Carpenter films in general, what do his films kind of mean to you as a fan of his work?
Well, I guess, what they mean to me is Carpenter has just always been one of my biggest inspirations as both a horror fan and a film lover, and someone who wanted to be involved in film. I mean, just stepping aside from the fact that Christine was my first film and first horror film, Carpenter's just always kind of been a part of my life in a sense, because after that I became more and more involved in the horror genre, and then Michael Myers was my first iconic slasher villain. Halloween I saw before Nightmare on Elm Street and Texas Chainsaw and all of those. And then, Carpenter sort of became Halloween for me, basically. My favorite holiday and month of the year was Carpenter. And we would go to Six Flags in Illinois. And I don't know if you've ever been to Fright Fest, but all day long, they're just playing the Halloween theme. And like, it does not stop. And so, we'd go there every October, and I just hear the Halloween theme the entire time. And I don't know, his film's just always been there. Like, I have these odd memories that I can pull from life that revolve around Carpenter. So like, when I first got braces, if anyone's ever had braces listening, your first night sucks.
Yep.
Have you had braces?
Yeah, I have. It's the worst.
Yeah, so that first night's terrible because you get all those rubber bands in your teeth, and it's starting to adjust everything. So you wake up in the middle of the night and everything's just super sore, right? And so my first night having them, I remember I woke up in the middle of the night at like 2 or 3 in the morning. I was a young kid, and as a young kid, you think any little bit of pain is like you're dying. So so I was just like, what the hell is going on? And anyway, I couldn't sleep, so I turned on the TV, and that ended up being the first time I watched The Fog. The Fog was just beginning, and I ended up watching it the whole way through until like 5 in the morning. And so I just have little memories like that all throughout. And then as far as what his work has kind of meant to me, I've always just felt very inspired by Carpenter's direction. So I started writing screenplays around the time of 12 or 13, and one thing that always stuck with me whenever I'd be writing is I found myself kind of sort of following Carpenter's style of how he portrays villains in a sense, because you look back at, say, Assault on Precinct 13, and it's a relatively simple film, just about I don't remember if they're gang members or we'll just call them villainous people. There's all these people that want to break into this police station to get a prisoner there, and it could have been done like your typical action standoff film, and just been very action heavy and not have much mystery to it or anything like that. And instead, Carpenter presents it like this horror film almost, because the people surrounding the precinct and breaking into it, you never actually see their faces. They're all just these dark silhouettes, and so they feel almost kind of supernatural themselves. And so I've often found that coming up in my writing, where if I have an opportunity for a moment like that, I choose that route instead of kind of going the more revealing route, I guess. It's always more interesting to me to not put a face to things, and to have more of that mystery. So I think in that sense, Carpenter's really worked his way into my writing, because I'd always much rather go with something like that than the more obvious route. So I don't know if I answered your question at all, but
No, you did. No, that was fantastic. And I think that is the most telling thing about Carpenter's work, in that he's able to take these concepts that they can be summed up in basically like a sentence, right? They're very simplistic premises, and yet the way that he executes on them is so memorable. And it's kind of like you said, whether it's Halloween or it's Assault on Precinct 13, I mean, everything kind of has a horror tinge to it, or it's obviously straight up horror. And that silhouettes example is fantastic because it really speaks to the heart of like a horror movie, right? You never want to reveal the monster, the killer, or whatnot until probably the third act all the way. And yet this is a siege movie, an action, not a traditional action movie, but it is very much like a siege film. And to have that quality of it, like I literally rewatched the film the other night, Assault on Precinct 13, and it's one of those movies that it was unbelievable to me that I had only just revisited it for the first time, because it is so indicative of a lot of his later works in a way that you have to be familiar with his work to kind of pick up on a lot of the little things that he would incorporate in his later films from Assault on Precinct 13. But it is very telling in a way that, it's one of those movies that it kind of, you can almost see the next 10 years of his career laid out and the different avenues and stylistic choices that he has in all of his films to some extent or another.
Oh, for sure. I mean, even just looking at The Fog, the two actually feel very similar.
Absolutely.
Because you are having characters being assaulted by basically an unseen force, and they're such, like, conceptually they're such different movies. But that's the thing with Carpenter, that I think is part of the reason why his work has really stood the test of time and why he eventually became, revered as this master of horror. Because, and I hate to say this, but you look at other directors who I love, like Wes Craven, for example, and Wes Craven's made a lot of amazing films. None of us would disagree with that. But the thing with Craven is, I don't know that anybody who had only seen one Wes Craven film could then watch another Wes Craven film and say, oh, that's Wes Craven.
Right.
He tends to be kind of more of a chameleon with his movies, where where they all feel stylistically a little bit different. Whereas Carpenter, all of his films, they have that kind of Carpenter vibe, right?
Yep.
They all have those sort of stylistic choices that make his work stand out as his own. And as simple as it is, that silhouette in the shadows thing is kind of very Carpenter-esque. Like, he kind of made that his own. So
yeah, and that Carpenter-esque aesthetic and kind of touch that he has on everything, it feels very natural no matter what it is, whether it's Assault on Precinct 13 or it's Halloween, right? A lot of the different stylistic things that he employs in his films, they never feel intrusive, whereas they might feel with a couple of Wes Craven movies, right? Where if you watch one of those movies, it very much feels like he's going for what he did in a previous film, whereas Carpenter is really able to translate his overall style in a way that makes sense for the story he's telling, and yet it still has the markings and the trappings of this is Carpenter style.
Exactly.
But in transitioning to the film that you picked for us to talk about today, which is none other than the second entry in Carpenter's Apocalypse trilogy, Prince of Darkness.
One of his most underrated films ever.
Absolutely, and I really want to get into that because initially, when I first saw this film like 5 or 6 years ago, it didn't click with me the way that it did on my rewatch recently this week. But for those who are unfamiliar, the film begins with a priest played by frequent Carpenter collaborator Donald Pleasance, who uncovers a cylinder filled with a mysterious green liquid within a deserted church. Priest then contacts Professor Barak, played by another recurring Carpenter favorite, Victor Wong, who recruits a team of students to help him uncover the mystery of the cylinder, though they inevitably discover that if the cylinder is opened, it could bring about the end of the world via the anti-God entity, essentially the Prince of Darkness. And so I was interested to learn that this idea for the film actually came from a dream that Deborah Hill had, apparently, that she was describing to Carpenter, which, again, even though she was not the producer on this film like she was with so many of his other movies that are iconic films, such as Halloween, obviously, and Escape from New York, I mean, again, it kind of just shows the strength of that collaboration between the two of them.
You know, I think I just posted about this the other day. It was the late Deborah Hill's birthday recently, and I've been really glad to see more recognition for her lately. Because for a very long time, I think, well, you know, especially with Carpenter coming up in the 80s and regretfully, you know, both the film world and the general public not giving more credit to women in the industry at the time, she really went unnoticed for a long time.
Yeah.
And it's been really nice to see us kind of looking back and saying, no, Deborah Hill deserves just as much credit as Carpenter through those first few years, because she was a huge part of Halloween, Halloween 2, The Fog, Escape from New York, Halloween 3. You know, like she had an influence on all those films. And yeah, so it is funny, you know, Prince of Darkness, even though she didn't co-write or I don't think she produced it, I'm not sure, but yeah, it was based on a dream of hers, and so she still has kind of a big involvement with the film because it's all about her in a sense. So but yeah, but it's what's interesting about Prince of Darkness, because, you know, the film itself is so convoluted and strange and kind of dreamlike that, you know, as far as I understand, Carpenter's whole point was to kind of capture that sort of nightmarish, kind of confusing feeling that we have from dreams. And, you know, he wanted to capture that fear that Deborah Hill had waking up from the dream. Right. And I think in some ways he accomplished that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's even more fitting that this film is poised as like his return to horror, right? After Big Trouble in Little China, which was considered like a box office failure. He kind of this was his first independent film, I believe, since that, and kind of wanting to stray away from big studio films. And I think it's very telling that he's taking a step back from what he had been doing. He's coming back to horror, and he's able to really capture the essence of horror in a way that I think is why this film is so underrated, and because it's not the traditional types of horror. And I want to get into comparing it to the other two chapters in the Apocalypse trilogy of his, which this is sandwiched in between The Thing and In the Mouth of Madness. But before we kind of get too much into that, I'm curious, what about Prince of Darkness makes it stand out to you amongst his other films?
The atmosphere. It's the atmosphere and the strangeness of it, because Carpenter, you know, whatever he was toying with, there's generally a logic to his films. He generally seems to have a pretty good understanding of what's happening and why and all of that. And with Prince of Darkness, you know, like you said, he was incredibly frustrated by the studio realm, and I think that had been a long time coming, because I know that The Thing was kind of supposed to be his big break into, you know, bigger and better things, and then it ended up being a box office bomb, and so he kind of I know that was very painful for him, and I think that he never quite got past that during that period. And, you know, when you stack up these other failures such as Big Trouble in Little China, I think that he just got really frustrated with the studio realm and wanted to go back to his roots and do something a little bit more fun that he could play with. And so the thing that I really love about Prince of Darkness is that, you know, as far as I understand, it was actually inspired by a viewing of Argento's Inferno. Carpenter, I forget which magazine he had told this to in an interview, but he basically had seen Inferno and decided, you know, I really want to play with something like that. This free narrative structure that doesn't really have to make sense, which was a lot of, you know, Italian horror at that time. It's
right.
You watch it and there's very little logic, and it's more just a lot of weirdness and you know, just kind of a different realm sort of. But anyway, Prince of Darkness is kind of his homage to that. You know, it's not a straight up homage to Italian horror, but it's his version of it. You know, it's his film where he didn't feel like he had to stick to any sort of narrative logic. In fact, you know, I just revisited the commentary recently with him and Peter Jason on the film, which, by the way, anyone who's a commentary nerd, I highly recommend this commentary because it's basically just Carpenter and Jason making fun of each other the whole time. But
right.
But during the commentary, you know, Peter Jason's asking him all kinds of questions of, you know, oh, what does this mean, and where did that idea come from, and what's this, and the entire time Carpenter is just he flat out says at one point, I have no idea what any of this meant. I just tried to write weird shit. And you know, and all of that just comes through with Prince of Darkness. It's I really like films like this where it's just completely open to interpretation. You know, there's no spoon feeding of logic to you. There's no direct answer as to what's happening. It's the kind of film where, you know, someone like you and I can sit here for hours and just kind of go over, what is this really about? You know?
Right.
And so I just love that. I love the spooky atmosphere of it and the imagery. You know, this is one of Carpenter's few films that uses a lot of religious iconography, and it's such a spooky movie. You know, I don't know a better way to put it than that. It's just such a spooky, weird movie, and in that sense, it just stands out from anything else he's ever done.
Absolutely, and for all of those fantastic reasons you just gave, I think that's why this did not click with me the first time I watched it, because I was very spoiled in the fact that I believe so. The first Carpenter film I saw was Halloween, and then I think the following one was The Thing, and so I had this very kind of,
I mean, you're spoiled at that point.
Yeah, I'm spoiled at that point, right? And not to say that I'm comparing Prince of Darkness to those films, but it's more about this idea that I kind of had a very straightforward view of what Carpenter films entailed. And so to not have any recurring kind of like big monster moments for much of this film, Prince of Darkness, I remember walking away and feeling kind of disappointed the first time I watched it, right? It's kind of like, hey, this is very, very different from what I expect from this director whose films I love so much. And so it wasn't until this recent rewatch where the film really stands out as a kind of just a strong example of his sort of like versatile toolbox of tension, right? Because for a majority of that movie, it's very much atmosphere that's built on just kind of capturing surroundings where strange events are happening, and yet they're not so overtly supernatural up to a certain point that anybody has a concrete reason to get up and leave and just kind of like run away screaming into the night, right? Until obviously the cylinder opens up and things start coming out. But I mean, earlier I mentioned Prince of Darkness is the second entry in the Apocalypse trilogy, which is sandwiched between 1982's The Thing and 1994's In the Mouth of Madness. And the thing that connects all three of these films, of course, is their kind of apocalyptic narrative stakes, right? The end of the world is going to come about if this evil is not defeated or contained. But again, as we've been saying, Prince of Darkness is so stylistically different, I find, from those two films. What about this film do you think, compared to those two, stylistically is kind of just leaps and bounds different?
So it's different between them. First of all, I think in comparison to The Thing, it's a much different kind of story, you know? I mean, it's still this contained film where you have people turning into things, you know, so it's, and all three of them are similar in that sense, and they're, you know, now that I'm even just thinking about it, there are quite a few similarities between the three, but in terms of stylistic differences, I mean, again, it just goes back to the strangeness of it, you know, and in comparison to the Thing, because In the Mouth of Madness is also very kooky.
Yeah.
You know, it's a tough question, actually, because I do think that it's very similar to In the Mouth of Madness. But when you look at The Thing, again, it's, you know, it's kind of like this slower burn in a sense. I mean, The Thing really gets going really quick. Because, you know, you have that kind of strange opening, and then all of a sudden you've got dogs transforming into monsters and flamethrowers, and everyone's losing their damn mind, you know. And like you said, Prince of Darkness really takes a long time to kind of get going, in a sense, because again, I feel like Carpenter is just in this sandbox of just seeing what he can throw at the screen and what will allow, without questioning too much, you know, because through the whole first half of the movie, I mean, you're getting eclipses and worms on the window, and oh, there's this guy with cockroaches all around his feet, or beetles or whatever, and then, oh, we got Alice Cooper hanging out in the alleyway just staring at the building for like 15 hours straight, you know. So it's Prince of Darkness is, in a sense, let me put it this way. I feel like Prince of Darkness is reflective of an apocalypse itself, in the sense that, you know, when you think the apocalypse, you think brimstone and fire raining from the skies, and, you know, Satan on a skeleton horse riding towards you. I don't know, whatever your idea of the apocalypse is, it's big, right? And with Prince of Darkness, the way an apocalypse will really happen is, you know, it's slow. It starts small.
It's gradual.
It's gradual, you know. And in Prince of Darkness, everything starts small, you know, and really even the climax isn't necessarily a big bang, right? And so I feel like in that sense, Prince of Darkness, even though it's about the apocalypse, it's more about the beginning of the apocalypse, in a sense. And man, I'm not answering this question right.
No, I think that's very true, in that it is a stylistically different, and it takes its time, right, in building up to that in a way that feels much more gradual. It feels slow. It's all about, it's not about overt force. It's not about a mutant dog that's going to start turning into things and mutating, and we're not going to see a guy come crashing through a window with an axe asking about Sutter Kane and all this stuff.
Exactly.
It's very gradual. The threat comes from inside. It's all about influence rather than kind of this overt force, which I had such a great appreciation for, because that is what stands out to me amongst those other films. They're all isolated to a certain extent. They're all about the end of the world, and yet it's not, the stakes are not in your face from the opening 15 minutes or so, right? I mean, this movie has, I think it's like a 12-minute intro almost of credits, and it's not this explosive opening. It's not the shootout of Assault on Precinct 13. It's not the Scandinavian shootout of The Thing. It's a college campus being cut between shots of the priest being discovered dead, and then Donald Pleasance is learning about the cylinder and whatnot.
Oh, and this is a good point too, is, you know, take The Thing, for example. You mentioned stakes, and even though on the surface level the stakes are similar in The Thing and Prince of Darkness, in the sense that we're dealing with a small isolated group that's slowly being taken over one by one, in The Thing there's a very real sense of pretty early on, I would say by mid-film, that we cannot let this thing escape, or it will be the end of the world. You know, like, you have the doctor going through the whole simulation of it would take just a matter of weeks or days until the entire world is just demolished by the thing, right? And in The Mouth of Madness, I mean, we in The Mouth of Madness, you begin at the brink of the end of the world because everyone's already losing their mind, right? And Prince of Darkness is very different in that sense, because we don't really understand what the consequence of Prince of Darkness is, at least not until the very end, maybe. And so there isn't really that sense throughout that the world is about to end. Instead, it's like it actually makes me think of a line from In the Mouth of Madness where I want to say it's Sam Neill in the beginning who says, every species can sense its own demise. And Prince of Darkness kind of feels like the film leading up to that line, because Prince of Darkness, everything is so subtle. It's like a gut feeling, you know, the worms on the window, the eclipse, all of that. It's this gut feeling of something's coming, but we don't know what. Right. And we don't know, and because we don't know what, we don't know how to fight it, and we don't know what to do about it.
And now for a brief intermission. If you've been enjoying this episode of Daily Horror Habit, please take a moment to subscribe to the show on your preferred streaming platform or leave us a review on iTunes. And thank you for your continued support, and I hope you enjoy the remainder of today's horrifying episode. And it definitely makes all the characters have a lot more doubt, right? I mean, to a certain extent, in The Thing and in The Mouth of Madness, the characters start to question things. They start to question whether this is actually happening or not to a certain degree. But I feel like there's a lot more chaos in Prince of Darkness amongst the core cast themselves, right? People are doubting up until the moment where they look up and they see the green goo on the ceiling, and then it's being sprayed down their throats, to a degree that I don't think that type of chaos kind of ensues amongst the characters in those other two films. But in going back to the isolation that you mentioned, I noticed on a rewatch also just this is very much a urban isolated movie that feels very real in a sense that the other two don't for me. And I find that like The Thing, it's in the middle of Antarctica. That might as well be another planet compared to where we're at. In The Mouth of Madness, it's kind of this sleepy little town that is engulfed in this Cthulhu magic. And yet in this bustling metropolis, nobody in the outside world realizes what's happening. They don't realize the stakes of what's happening. And I love that there's so many shots that go from what's happening at the end of the film, where we have these basically demon-possessed zombies walking around and trying to influence their will and kill people furthermore. And we get these cuts of the street, and there's either just people walking or there's just cars driving by. There's no indication that anybody outside of this building understands what's happening. And for that to be set in a very grounded location, like, to me, that kind of just further speaks to how different this film is. This film feels like the stakes are higher somehow than the other two films for me.
Oh, that's actually a great observation. Because you're right, you know, you do look at The Thing in the Mouth of Madness, and there's a disconnected reality for the general observer, right? For, like you're saying, for you and I've never lived in Antarctica. I've never stayed in space for 2 years of my life. I don't have that experience. And in The Mouth of Madness, I mean, the whole small town thing, even if you live in a small town, you've never lived in a small town like that, right? It feels very different. And you're right, Prince of Darkness, it feels like it's set in our reality. And I mean, I live in Los Angeles, and I recognize, some of the areas where it's at. And I love that you point out that there are just people walking by on the street that don't realize, that they don't realize those homeless people outside the church are possessed. They don't realize what's going on in the basement of the church. And there is something really kind of brilliant about that. I just, kind of off topic, I just recently revisited the Blumhouse film Dark Skies about the aliens that are tormenting a family, right? It's an okay film, but one thing that really stands out to me in that is there's a line towards the end where the main characters go to this guy who's supposed to know everything about what's going on with the aliens, and he says something like, the war's already over. It happened. The invasion already happened. We lost, and they're here with us. And there's something so much more terrifying about that idea that all of this horror is just going on underneath our noses. Like I could go walk by that church, and meanwhile this anti-god is taking over everybody and turning them into burnt corpses, and the devil's about to come here and just destroy us all, and we wouldn't know, because to us it just looks like your typical little rundown church on the outside, so there really is something that's frightening about this idea of evil not attacking us from the outside but coming up from within.
And I think that also Victor Wong, I believe, even has a line in the film where he talks about the idea that somebody's trying to call out to people on the street, oh, we need help, and he goes, no one out there can help us. And that kind of bleeds into this idea that the film's kind of like central theme essentially is crossing science and faith in a way that I don't remember many of Carpenter's films kind of dealing explicitly in the two. It's either one or the other, right? It's either the science element of like in The Thing, or there's a faith element in, I believe, Village of the Damned. But in terms of kind of just crossing those two realms and making it interwoven into a way that makes for a really, again, unique story that kind of begins to dabble in elements that he doesn't necessarily always mix, which, I mean, quantum mechanics comes into play in the film, and yet it's never presented like it's not overburdening, right? It's kind of like the bare bones in a way that it's never alienating, and yet it's very accessible, I feel like, to everybody. And then he has such a great like horror vocabulary at this point in his career, whether audiences at the time were acknowledging it or not, that again, it's very easy for him to blend these two polar opposite topics in a way that makes for a horror film that feels very strange and different, like you said, and yet he's almost kind of just expanding on his storytelling abilities.
You know, it's one of the so first of all, I love, like what you just said. I it's one thing I really appreciate about this film as well is that combination of science and just like weirdo Italian horror, right? But it's one thing that, you know, maybe I'm wrong. I feel like it gets lost that Carpenter is very into science. You know, I feel like maybe there's a lot of people that aren't quite as familiar with that fact about him, but he's very into science. And actually, I think right before reading this film, he had finished reading all about this, what's it called? Quantum uncertainty theory.
That sounds right.
Yeah, and I don't know shit about quantum physics, so I'm not going to sit here and try to explain what that is. But he had just finished reading about that, and something that I think gets lost in this film, which is unfortunate, is that a lot of people do assume that it's about the devil, and even though that's, you know, it's a fine assumption, it's not wrong necessarily to consider that, because again, you know, there's no logic in this movie. It's very much up to interpretation. But, you know, Carpenter himself was sort of thinking of it as an anti-God, which I think you had mentioned earlier describing the plot. That's what it is. It's an anti-God. It's an anti-force. So it's not necessarily the devil and the Antichrist. It's this anti-force, you know, and that's kind of his explanation for how all this weird shit's going on, like the earthworms on the windows and everything. You know, it's like this weird quantum displacement sort of thing going on. Again, I'm not going to try to explain it. I'm not a scientist. But
I agree, though, because I think that his ability to do that, again, I mean, you even get like the supernova that's on the TV when the main character is like playing cards, which is his one of his defining traits. But I mean, overall, yeah, his ability to blend those different things together, and it does the film a disservice when people talk about it, and it's this like oversimplification of it being about just the devil and demons and all of these things, whereas it's going somewhere much deeper than that. But again, like you said, it comes back to this idea that the film has a lot more interpretations than I guess if people aren't as familiar with Carpenter's work and they're not as in-depth into kind of just like breaking down the films in a certain way like we are, I suppose they can have that oversimplification, but it lends to this film having multiple layers that I don't necessarily think the other two films in the Apocalypse trilogy have necessarily. Those are much more straightforward films, and that's not saying that those films don't have a lot of different elements going into them, but it's just those films are much more kind of linear in terms of what they're setting out to do, whereas I think Prince of Darkness, there's a lot more interpretations, and there's just a lot more elements in it that a viewer can pick up on and kind of, again, interpret differently.
For sure, you know, there are a few layers to it, and it's why it's I mean, I would never say it's not acceptable to have a certain opinion on a film, but it's why it's acceptable to have the opinion that that it is Satan and the Antichrist, you know, which by the way, just something I found interesting that I'd never actually thought of is supposedly the green goo is the anti-God's son and not the anti-God itself, which in fact, but what is interesting here is that, you know, Carpenter has this idea of this anti-God, this anti-force, but even the characters in the film, most of them seem to understand it as the devil. And you see it in the translated text as well, that even the translated text is talking about this prince of darkness, Satan, the devil. And to me, it's kind of like it's a small commentary on this idea of how human beings put labels on things that we don't understand. And so you can imagine that if this old order, I forget what they're called, the Order of Sleep, you can imagine that if they came across whatever this is, they probably would have thought it was the devil, because that's our interpretation of evil, right? Well, it must be the devil, it must be Satan, it must be whatever your religion's opposite to good is. That's what this is. And it turns out it goes much deeper than that and is involved with physics and atoms and the scientific forces of the world. And so so for a casual observer, it makes sense that you would say that's the devil, because I think evil is related to Satan. Whereas in this case, it's really just saying, no, it's just that every object has, or every force has an opposite. And in this case, there's good, so to speak, and evil, which is this anti-god.
In you saying that, it made me start to think the irony of the fact that all of the people that brought to the church, essentially, they're all there because they're all brilliant. The only really overtly religious figure in the film is Donald Pleasance as the priest, right? And everybody else there are people of science, essentially. And yet they kind of jump to that oversimplification as soon as they start to see more supernatural things where, oh, it's the devil, it's demons and all of these things. And I think that part of that might be Carpenter, or maybe I'm just reading too much into it, but it seems to me that it's Carpenter almost commenting on hysteria and just the human reliance or human shortcomings of just fear, and how these kids that are there, these college students, they're all supposed to be these brilliant people. And yet as soon as things become more overtly terrifying while they're there, they kind of throw all of that out the window. All the reasons that they're there get thrown out the window, and they start succumbing to fear and kind of this oversimplification of what's happening.
They shrink right back to our most primal instincts, right? For example, you go outside and it's dark out, you hear a strange noise. You don't sit there and think to yourself, well, scientifically, it's most likely an owl, or what. Mm-hmm. You don't go through that thought process. You think the worst. You think right. Whatever you're most afraid of, that's what's in the dark.
Yeah.
And so that's a very primal thing that humans do. So no, you're exactly right. These are all brilliant characters except for the priest, and yet their first instinct is to jump to the worst thing that they can think of. Because when you're posed with fear like that, that's what we do. You don't think logically.
And so earlier we were talking about how Carpenter is able to kind of take his stylistic elements and he's able to imprint them onto everything he does, but in a way that matches specifically whatever project it is, right? So it never really feels like, oh, he's doing a Halloween thing here, he's doing an Assault on Precinct 13 element here. It's more just his style that's able to bleed into the types of stories that he's trying to tell. So that way it feels very organic. And I mean, this film, again, I think what separates it from a lot of his other films is that it is so strange, and he's able to incorporate so many different types of scares into this. Whereas a film like Halloween, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It's a slasher. It's a guy in a mask with a knife. In The Mouth of Madness, there's these Cthulhu monsters that take different shapes and forms, but essentially it's the boogeyman in real life, or the personification of the boogeyman, these monsters. But in this film, he's able to really, again, he's able to weaponize kind of the dread throughout the entire film, and that pacing and that buildup. That way, when he has a moment that feels like it reverts to, I don't want to simplify it to a slasher kill, but like with Alice Cooper and the bike, right? That's kind of like he skewers that one guy who, for some reason, doesn't run away when he sees a pigeon crucified. But, I mean, like that's a very kind of straightforward horror moment. Yeah, but that's a very straightforward horror moment that I think hits a lot harder than I was expecting, at least, just because of the buildup of the film. There's so much anticipation that something horrifying is building. Something is going to happen. We don't know what it is. And kind of in that unknowingness, that kill is a lot more powerful than I initially thought when I watched the movie. When I first saw the movie, I was like, okay, that's like a slasher-esque kill that we've probably seen implemented in multiple films. But in this movie, to have such a visceral act of violence that by some extent it's not that far removed from what we're used to, I feel like there's so much smart buildup to it that it is one of the most memorable moments in the entire film.
Oh, for sure. And first off, fun fact about that is, for anyone who's ever wondered what the hell is Alice Cooper doing in this movie, it's because of that gag. So don't know, Alice, I guess I've never seen it myself, but Alice had a thing that he did on stage with this bike gag. So like that bike was actually his own prop. And he wanted to be in the movie, and Carpenter said, well, if we can use that kill in the movie, then you can be in it. That's what Cooper's doing there. But no, I think I see what you're saying. Like the film is set up in such a way that you don't expect that sort of visceral kill, right? You maybe expect something more supernatural or less violent or less graphic, and so it does really hit you in that way. And even just being a Carpenter fan, I have to imagine this was a pretty off-putting experience for a lot of his fans at the time, especially because other than The Thing, you know, Carpenter's not really a gore guy, you know,
right.
Like not a lot of people know that he's not really one who wants a lot of blood in his movies. Like he'll use it if it's practical and if it makes sense for the story, but I mean, you know, just look at Halloween, for example, barely a drop of blood in that film, you know?
Right.
And so Prince of Darkness, I mean, this is one of his more graphic, violent, kind of bloody movies. And I feel like that in combination with the strange spookiness of it, you know, it really is just it's a hard viewing for first timers. Like, you know, you had mentioned you weren't much of a fan your first time. I wasn't either, to be honest. My first time seeing it was when I was in my teens at some point, and you know, I remember thinking kind of similar to what you did, of just like, oh, what the hell was that, you know?
Right.
This isn't The Thing or Halloween, you know, what the hell's going on here? And but yeah, once you step back and really appreciate it, it does. I love that. I love that aspect of it, that it does have different ways that it gets you. And, you know, in that sense, again, it does go back to Italian horror in a sense, and kind of how a lot of those films are, is, you know, I think of, I'm probably getting this wrong, but I think of like Suspiria, which is very, you know, supernatural and spooky and weird, right? But then it also alternates with these random moments of just extreme violence that just come out of nowhere that you don't expect. And actually, I think there's a scene that takes place in an open space in Suspiria where someone kind of is running out and stabbing someone or whatever, and that's very similar to what happens here in Prince of Darkness with the guy who's just standing out there, and then the homeless woman comes out and you don't really see her at all, you just see the hand and the blade.
No, yeah, I think that the way that he's able to catch the viewer off guard with, I would say they're definitely the more gratuitous kills of his career. They're gratuitous, and yet they're sparingly used. Like, right, again, I think the word restraint is one that is apt for this film, in that
Absolutely.
He has so much restraint, which obviously feeds into the slow buildup of the entire film, but also the idea that not every single kill is gratuitous in that way. And we have those are probably the two biggest moments of like gratuitous violence, where you've got blood spurting out of this guy. One guy gets stabbed like 30 times by a homeless woman with a pair of scissors. But then he reverts back to types of scares that are very indicative of Carpenter, right? Then we have that guy's body gets filled with the beetles, and he's got this creepy, altered voice where he's saying, I have a message for you. You're not going to like it. Pray for death. Pray for death. These very they're indicative of Carpenter's style, and he's not being, that's an example of like, it's not gratuitous because you see this guy's got beetles on, but it's still unnerving. And again, like you said, we don't see all of him. We see he just looks like a guy in a suit at first, and he's engulfed in the shadows. And then when you move up, the camera pans into him, then you see, oh, he's covered in beetles. And then obviously his limbs start to fall off, which is a little more gratuitous than,
a little more.
I guess. Yeah, just a little more. But on a rewatch for me, though, one thing that was ultimately more disturbing that I didn't pick up on initially, because I I don't know, maybe it was too jarring of an experience to my previous experience with Carpenter films, but the reality is of this film is that the homeless people aren't necessarily the ones that do much of the killing, right? They kill 2 people, I believe, in the entire film, and the rest of the people that get killed, they get killed either by one another, where 2 of the women get thrown out of a window, or at the end of the film and stopping eventually the anti-god trying to bring father back through the mirror gets smashed, and then everybody else dies. It's more kind of just, hey, we have to do these things, and they're probably going to be, the results of our actions are going to be us essentially killing one another, which, I mean, that's far more, it's far more disturbing to me.
Well, look, so at the core of all 3 of these films, what are they really about? They're about us turning on each other, you know, and maybe your audience is lucky we didn't talk about In the Mouth of Madness, because I probably would have rambled about that for like 5 hours straight. But you know, In the Mouth of Madness in this trilogy is one that I think about often these days, because there's a line from Sam Neill that, or no, not Sam Neill, the opposite, I forget the actress's name, but there's a line from her when they're driving in the car that seriously spooks me to this day, which is something along the lines of, what you consider sane is because everyone else shares your opinion of what reality is, right? But the second that the majority considers reality to be something different than what you consider reality to be, now you're the crazy one. And so I put that in context a lot with our current politics, which isn't even just, you know, limited to just America. You're seeing it around the world, where there's one group of people who don't believe in science and who basically live in a different reality, and there's other people like you and I who believe in science and believe in reality, right? And the scary thing sometimes is if one group becomes the predominant group, if that anti-science group became the predominant one, we would be the crazy ones. So anyway, so back to Prince of Darkness, that is at the heart of all 3 of these apocalypse films, is this idea of the apocalypse won't necessarily come from an outside force. It will most likely come from us tearing each other apart, because even though there are these sinister forces in each of these 3 stories, you know, at the core of them, they're all about us turning on each other. So you know, I think that's kind of the commentary with all of them, is that's when things begin to fall apart, is when you stop working together and start seeing each other as the other, right? So no, that is the frightening thing about Prince of Darkness, like you said, is the evil itself eliminates very few people in the film. It's mostly, as you mentioned, us taking out each other.
Yeah. And again, to come back to kind of what I mentioned earlier, in that it's not about overt force, right? In The Thing, the monster is kind of ripping you apart. Obviously, that's much more in your face throughout the entire film, and it's pushing people to their breaking point much faster. But I mean, again, to come back to the film being feeling so restrained, in that, especially the Alice Cooper-led homeless people, they barricade the doors, but it's never them breaking through and they're at the throats of all of these people. It's about isolating people and then making them deal with an internal threat that, I mean, like you said, that ultimately is what is so terrifying about this film. Because, I mean, had this movie just been possessed demons and all of that kind of thing that we would probably be pretty used to, I mean, for me personally, like, that's not the types of movies that I'm necessarily super interested in. And this would have felt very foreign to those 2 other entries in the Apocalypse trilogy, in that at the core of it is about people tearing one another down in a way that, again, it feels so restrained, because I think it's the last 35 minutes of the movie where things are inarguably overtly supernatural.
Well, it's like a cancer in a sense, right? I mean, you know, Prince of Darkness, you're absolutely right. And this is what's very different about this film compared to other Siege films, is that the possessed homeless, they're not trying to get in. You know, they essentially barricade the building and contain these people. But it's the people that are trying to get out.
Right.
You know, they're not trying to keep these others from coming in, they're trying to get out. And you know, so the evil, it is like a cancer that just kind of works its way through this contained space and through these people, where it's just slowly disintegrating and, you know, just taking away everything and eliminating them. And so and you know, and I always take that kind of idea back to, again, humanity's hatred, or whatever you want to call it, for differences in one another, right? That in itself is like a cancer that eats you up and eats you up until it finally just takes over and you're no longer like who you were, right? So that's what this film reminds me a lot of too, is just this idea of, you know, just this thing that's just slowly working its way through you, like this dislike or this hatred that turns you against others. I don't know, which is probably a reading that maybe doesn't apply to this movie, but
I would agree with that though, and I think that the way Carpenter handles it is so smart, right? We don't get a whole lot of scenes of characters bickering about their beliefs and all these things, because that would be a bit on the nose and kind of, again, exactly what you would expect, right? The one man of faith is shouting, I'm the only one that knows what's happening, and then the other people kind of spend the rest of the film demonizing him, right? Again, I think Carpenter's ability to take these very controversial sides, essentially, and he's able to meld it into a story that's approachable to essentially either side, I find is very rare. Usually filmmakers, you know, it's pretty over the top for one side or the other in a lot of ways, or at least the portrayal of the sides is always extrapolated to a almost unrealistic degree.
Right.
Yeah. But I think that, again, that's something that I think stands out more to me than necessarily, I mean, I don't know your thoughts on this, but like the performances in this movie don't necessarily do a lot for me in terms of, I know it's awesome that Carpenter gets to have these collaborators that he's frequently worked with, and yet I don't know that this film stands out to me as like, oh, that's a really great Donald Pleasance performance, or that's a very memorable Victor Wong performance. I think it's more about the way that he makes this film, and it's almost just more about the themes and the story rather than necessarily the individuals themselves. How do you feel about that?
No, I agree. It's I mean, this is not Pleasance's best performance in a Carpenter movie. This is not Wan's best performance in a Carpenter movie. And another way that it is a little bit different is, you know, this is also he does a few of these movies. The Fog is kind of similar in this sense, but it's an ensemble film from Carpenter, you know. So I think that has something to do with why you're not particularly attached to all these characters, is that it is more of an ensemble movie, and we're not really focused on one character's plot or the other. I mean, the deepest that we get is, I want to say the characters' names are Brian and Catherine, played by Jameson Parker and Lisa Blunt, but the deepest you really get with who these people are is them having a little spark, right?
Yeah.
And other than that, we don't get to know too much about them, and so it really just begins to boil down to, do they believe in the supernatural or not? I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, it probably helps in that regard that those elements are so strong, and that we avoid, kind of like what I was saying a few minutes ago, in that we avoid those big blow-ups where somebody is 150% invested in their faith, and or vice versa with their science background, and they just ends up being this devolving into a screaming match about who's right, who's wrong. So I suppose in that regard, that's actually a strength, right? If we had that Kurt Russell from The Thing character, then it would be such a defining voice that you would be hard pressed not to kind of move into the direction of what I was talking about a minute ago.
Well, look, and in this film, you don't have to take sides. Like you were saying before, that I think that is a strength of it, because it allows you to put yourself deeper into the shoes of everyone. You know, because characters like this that don't have a strong voice, they allow you to get deeper into that character, I think, because you're able to put more of yourself into that character. You know, because there's nothing about them that's going to make you stop and go, oh, well, I'm not like that, so maybe this person isn't like me. You know, they're such kind of blank slates that you can you can put yourself in them. And yeah, I agree. If this was like The Mist, that has, you know, this religious zealot and the opposite of that, trapped together, screaming over each other of who's right and who's wrong. Like, is it the apocalypse or is it a scientific disaster? Like, you know, if you had those voices screaming over each other the entire time, I think that takes away from, honestly, the weirdness of it, because a film like Prince of Darkness works best when you don't have an explanation. You know, when it is all completely open to interpretation, and I appreciate someone like Carpenter flat out admitting, I don't know what the hell's going on in this movie. You know, because that's the point. He wants us to look at it and try to understand it for ourselves. He doesn't have a agenda with this film, so to say, you know. And I always think filmmaking's better that way. I think when you go into it with a strong agenda, sometimes that can work, but oftentimes it's going to put off a certain set of viewers, you know. And I'd much rather go into a film and try to interpret what I think the director's saying as opposed to having them tell me what they're saying. So
absolutely, yeah, I think that's the perfect way to kind of describe this film in that sense, and I think that's why it does feel so foreign to the rest of his works, right? And it is a film that I for sure would not recommend first, like, or even within the first 3 Carpenter films, you know what I mean? Like, this would be in my top 5 but now because of my kind of newfound appreciation for it, and yet this is very much not a beginner Carpenter film. But
no.
It's part of what that's part of what I love about having guests on. They pick films that it forces me to go back and rewatch something that maybe I necessarily wouldn't based off of an initial reaction, and in getting to re-experience it in new context based on what I've been watching in the time since that, and kind of just more understanding about what the director is actually going for, it just gives me a whole new appreciation for it.
Well, you know, I mean, this is really good advice I think I'd give to any of your listeners, which is that never ever first of all, never let your first impression of a film define what you think of it, you know. Now granted, you and I as critics, like, sometimes we only get the time to watch
right,
watch it the one time, and that's our take on it. But in a general sense, you know, as a fan, I always recommend, like, say you hated a movie you saw 10 years ago, go back and rewatch it. You know, go back and rewatch these things, because the older we get and the different life experiences we have, the different approach you're going to take to each film. You know, so like, for example, I was talking about In the Mouth of Madness. I watched that movie when I was like 12, you know, and the themes of madness and the whole thing that I just described to you about, you know, different realities and who decides reality. I think about that completely differently now as an adult than I did as a kid, and it makes me appreciate the film more, you know. And other films I've discovered in that sense are like, people are gonna hate me for this, but like Jason Goes to Hell. I used to hate Jason Goes to Hell, and now I actually kind of dig it, because I'm like, all right, it's not really a Friday the 13th film per se, but it's actually a really fun body hopping movie, you know. So yeah, you take these things differently through life the older you get, and the more you're able to appreciate what they're trying to do. So no, yeah, I'll always go back and revisit stuff. But like you said, if you're introducing somebody to Carpenter, Prince of Darkness is not the way to start.
Right. I guess in sort of wrapping up then, that leads right into my final question for you, which is, if you had to make a double bill essentially of 2 Carpenter features for someone that's not familiar with his work, what would they be?
I mean, if you're not familiar with his work, I would say go with The Fog, and I'd say go with The Fog, and maybe this is a random one, but maybe Big Trouble in Little China. And the reason I say that is I think you get the best of both Carpenters with that double feature, you know, because The Fog I think is Carpenter's purest horror film, in the sense that, you know, first of all, it was his passion project. Like, he only agreed to do Halloween 2 so he could do that movie. And Halloween was a project that he was signed on to do, you know, that wasn't originally his thing that he wanted to do. So I think The Fog is like this pure horror film because it, you know, in a lot of senses, it feels like that ghost story by the seaside, right? Around the fire and the kids sitting around and getting spooked, you know, like that is The Fog to me. And like we've been talking about with his stylistic sensibilities, I mean, The Fog is pure Carpenter atmosphere from beginning to end. It never lets up. And so I would say that's a great one to kind of introduce fans to what Carpenter's horror vibe is like. And then Big Trouble in Little China, I think, is the opposite, where the other side of Carpenter is that, you know, unlike a lot of other filmmakers, like Carpenter does have films where he's trying to say something, you know, like They Live is obviously very anti-government and all that. But for the most part, the thing about Carpenter that I really love and that endears me to him is that, you know, Carpenter's not really always out there to sell you on something. Carpenter really just makes movies that have fun. And Big Trouble in Little China is the best example of that, I think, where it's just Carpenter going as big and as wild and as fun as possible. And he's not sitting there trying to make you think deeper about the Vietnam War or or, you know, about whether you can trust your neighbor or not. He's really just trying to entertain you with that film. So even though those two films are complete opposites, I think those two will give you a really good sense of who Carpenter is as a director.
Those are two fantastic choices. I mean, my first film is always rotating because it's one that I kind of want to pick to be the pure distillation of of why he's a master of horror. And then always my second feature is Big Trouble in Little China, just because it shows that he's versatile in something other than horror, right? I think, not to get too much into like comparing directors, but I mean, I believe you mentioned Wes Craven at the beginning of the show, and kind of talking about how some of his films, I think he has a much larger filmography, and he doesn't always hit the same marks that I would like him to in some of his films. But I mean, with Carpenter, he's able to go from something like The Fog to making a film that is indicative of his taste, and he's into comedies, he's into action movies, he's into martial arts movies, and he's able to kind of take those three things and put them in a package that is distinctly different from The Fog, genre-wise, and yet it feels like a John Carpenter movie still, right? He still has his mark all over that movie in ways that are obviously different to pertain to the genre, and yet it feels like something John Carpenter made.
Well, you know, to me, just focusing on the horror genre specifically, to me, there are two kinds of horror filmmakers. There's a filmmaker who makes horror films, and then there's the horror fan that makes horror films. And what I mean by that is, you know, Carpenter, I think has admitted, or at least he felt this way back around Halloween. Like he wasn't a huge horror fan. You know, that wasn't like his goal to be a horror master, right? He just wanted to make movies. And, you know, I mean, that's why he didn't start with horror. He started with Dark Star, which is like this weird sci-fi comedy, and then Assault on Precinct 13. And they showed those sensibilities that he would later put in the horror. But he was just a filmmaker who loves story. You know, he just loves movies, and that comes through in all of his work because he takes his style and he applies it to each and every genre. And what other filmmakers tend to do is, you know, as horror fans, like if that's your main thing and you're not necessarily a lover of all stories, but you just love horror and that's what you want to do, you know, you're feeling more inspired by previous horror films. And so I feel like you're trying to capture that magic rather than taking the story and putting your own spin on it. I don't know if that makes sense, but I just think
that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I just think the Carpenter, you know, why he's able to do that is because he's a connoisseur of all of this stuff. You know, instead of just focusing on one genre, he loves it all. So he's able to take all those story elements and combine them and you know, make them work, but also within the realm of his own style. So
yeah, I think that's a perfect way to put it, because you are almost handicapping yourself in the ways that you're able to tell a story. If you're like, oh, I'm just a diehard horror fan, and that's all I see and speak and breathe is horror, and I'm going to make a film like that. But like you said, more often than not, your entire pool of reference is going to be other horror films that came before it. And so that's why I would venture that a lot of people might say, like, from looking in the outside of the horror genre, they're like, oh, well, that's just derivative of this and this and this and this and this. Whereas I don't feel you can do that with many Carpenter films. Again, just based on his overall love of story and filmmaking, he's able to be more free in that regard.
Well, yeah, not at all. And even just with his work, you know, actually something that was interesting in the commentary that I hadn't really thought of with him is that He mentioned Star Wars during the commentary. I think when they're talking about the music and how the theme to Star Wars kind of changed the musical landscape of film, because it became this sort of blockbuster type score where, like, you know, movies afterwards, they all wanted to be big, you know, they want to force the emotion on you rather than have you come to the emotion, which, you know, I mean, like, scores, they typically are influencing how you feel, right? And if you watch a lot of Carpenter movies, his scores aren't like that. They're not in your face. They're underneath the picture, and they're creating more of a mood that allows you to kind of find where you feel personally. And anyway, so, you know, Carpenter describes how Star Wars kind of changed the film landscape into kind of developing into this mindset of making blockbusters, and that's what film became. And I don't think that's too hard to argue now, looking at, you know, what major studios are releasing. I mean, it's all about the blockbuster, you know. It's not about taking risks and doing something different for the most part. It's how big can you make it? And with Carpenter's movies, you know, he always wanted to be trying to do something different. It was never about trying to do the big spectacle. It was about just trying to tell a good story and do something that you hadn't necessarily seen before. So no, I absolutely agree with you. I do think that's a strength of Carpenter's work, is you don't really find a lot of derivative material with him, because he's always trying to move on to something else, which I think is also why he had no interest in doing Halloween sequels, because he didn't want to tell the same story again, right? So
right. That attitude of his is very telling, in that he hasn't made a film in a very long time, and yet it's one of those things. Yeah, since The Ward, which was what, 2010? Maybe around there.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. I know that.
Yeah, it was a long time ago, and I think that based on what the last 2 or 3 films he made looked like, I think it shows his strength as a filmmaker, that he realized probably, like, hey, maybe it's time for me to take a step back, just because we started to get, I don't know, around that time, I feel like we were seeing a lot of directors getting towards the end of their career, and it was the films they were producing were not necessarily indicative of why we were all going to see their films for a long time.
I think he started to find what unfortunately a lot of filmmakers found, was that no matter what your name, no matter who you are, the studios did not care. You know, the studios, they wanted whatever was hot. And so you look at Ghosts of Mars, and I mean, that came around right, not the same year, I don't believe, but that came around, you know, right around the time of Pitch Black and Event Horizon and other movies that were kind of exploring space horror, right? And and The Ward, I mean, The Ward feels like every other goddamn supernatural supernatural film from that time. You know, and so I think Carpenter made the right decision of, I'm going to step back. I'm going to take paychecks for remakes because I don't give a shit. Go do whatever you want. Just give me money. And I think he understood, you know, if I keep making movies, I'm going to keep being told no because the studio wants what it wants. It doesn't really care what I think anymore. And, you know, like, I mean, you've seen that with Spielberg. I mean, I know Spielberg has trouble getting a movie sold now, right? Fucking Steven Spielberg, you know, but the studios don't want Steven Spielberg doing his 3-hour Abraham Lincoln biopic, right? They want big studio Ready Player 8 movies. So
well, I think that's a good place to wrap up our conversation of John Carpenter and The Prince of Darkness. But I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me, man. But before I let you go, do you have anything you'd like to plug?
Sure. You can follow our site, where myself and Jay also write, at killerhorrorcritic.com. You can also follow us on @KillerFromSpace, where you can also find the podcast that I do with my wife, where we basically just goof around and talk horror movies and get a little buzzed and to have husband and wife type arguments over them. But yeah, that's about it. You know, just go ahead and follow killerhorrorcritic.com and @KillerFromSpace and follow Jay. Jay's awesome, although I assume you're following him if you're listening to this.
Well, as always, man, it was a pleasure chatting movies with you, and hopefully I look forward to having you on again in the future.
Yeah, no, it was great, man. Thanks for having me. This is a blast. And everyone, go see Prince of Darkness. If you're still listening to this, for God's sakes, go watch Prince of Darkness.
Absolutely, and listen to the commentary, because it sounds like the commentary has lots of juicy details about the movie.
It's just so funny. I mean, like I said, it's just Carpenter and Peter Jason just shitting on each other the whole time. So.
What's the not to love about that, right?
Nope.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Daily Horror Habit on your preferred streaming service and follow the show on Instagram at Daily Horror Habit and on Twitter at Daily Horror Pod for episode updates. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.